Hello colleagues and friends, I'm Julie Finlayson, the Research Fellow at the Centre for Native Title Anthropology based at the Australian National University. This video and podcast comprise the second of a series which the Centre for Native Title Anthropology is commissioning, with a focus on issues fundamental to the work of anthropologists in the native title arena. The first video cast is presented by Professor Emeritus Nick Peterson in conversation with Pascal Taplin and focuses on classical Aboriginal local organisation. This video and podcast is presented by Dr. John Morton in conversation with Cummings and flows on from the first one, where that first video cast explained 4 key elements of classical local organisation: the land-owning clans and their estates, and the land utilising bands and their ranges. This second one sets out principles of the fundamentally religious basis of classical Aboriginal societies, including local organisation, the nature of what anthropologists term descent groups, the nexus between Aboriginal people and their country, and the very meaning of life itself. This is a thoughtful and enlightening interview. It's an hour long, so we have made it available in 2 30-minute episodes. It's also available in both pod and video cast formats. Also downloadable from the site is a PDF of the presentation slides and texts, as well as key references. Please enjoy.
My name is Cummings and I'm an anthropologist who's been working in native title in WA since 2007. Today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. John Morton, who began his career in anthropology in 1975. Hi, John.
Hi, Carmen.
John, although I knew of your work before, you came sharply into focus for me in 2017 when you published a paper called Mother's Blood, Father's Land, Native Title and Comparative Land Tenure Modelling for Claims in Settled Australia. At this time, I was in the final stages of co-authoring the Nully Connection report with my fellow in-house anthro, Nissa Cahoon, and consultant anthropologist, Dr. David Martin. We'd spent a lot of time discussing the religious basis of connection and ultimately rights in land. And so one day just before we submitted, I got a very excited call from Dave, who was thrilled that you just put out a paper and something that followed our thinking pretty exactly. We then frantically went back through our report and added references to your paper all over the place, so thanks for that. It's great to have this chance to discuss something so dear to all of our hearts. I'd like to start by making a link between our topic, religion, and the earlier video cast with Pascal and Nick on local organisation. It's interesting because this series started with that topic, and here we are a few episodes later getting to talk about religion. And it reminded me of how one of the big changes that came from working closely with Dave was going from tacking religion on at the end, as I did in my first connection report on Budana, to putting it first and up front as the fundamental basis of the kinds of connections that the Native Title Act requires claimants to demonstrate, as we subsequently did with the Nully Connection report. My question is, do you think discussing systems of land ownership without grounding them in religious systems is putting the cart before the horse?
Yeah, let me just say first that Dave rang me too about that paper and was just as excited when he rang me. So I was walking on air for the rest of the day, which was good. Thank you, Dave.
Big fan.
Do I think it's putting the cart before the horse? Well, look, there's an old joke, which I think applies in this. context, I think it's actually more to do with putting Descartes before the horse. If you approach it the other way, you're involved in a kind of hyper-rationalist, a kind of materialist way of looking at things. The horse is the power that drags the cart, right? But the cart itself isn't animated. So you can kind of see something about Cartesian philosophy there. Descartes reckoned that the rest of the world, apart from human beings, was purely mechanical, right? It didn't have spirit, didn't have soul, and so on and so forth. And he thought, for example, that animals, other creatures were just machines because they didn't have souls. So nothing could be, well, I say nothing could be further from the way Aboriginal people see their environment, right? So what you've got there is a development in post-Enlightenment Western philosophy that leads to a materialist or a naturalistic outlook on the world, but retains a certain sort of spiritual outlook for human beings only. That doesn't work for Aboriginal people. And in my experience, Aboriginal people routinely object to it and say that they don't have that purely materialist outlook. I'd say that that's not to reject their own materialist outlook, but it does mean that the world, the environment, the creatures in it and all the rest of it are material plus. There's something else as well. And not only that they're comparable to, and the land itself is all comparable to us in the sense of sharing a form of spirituality that we might call soul, which we might call mind, which we might call whatever. So that's pretty fundamental, I think, for understanding everything about Aboriginal society, but it also about the way in which people connect to country. They connect to country, as we well know, and everybody who would be working in native title as an anthropologist would routinely be looking at the way in which some local area has dealt with its totems, with totemism. But if you start saying about a land tenure system, for example, that you inherit this from your mother, and you inherit it from your father, and you inherit it from the place where you were born or you were conceived, you elide or you downgrade all those connections, which are actually to totems, not just to people who once lived.
Yeah.
So it may not be putting the cart before the horse exactly. It's more like joining the cart and the horse and giving them both a rider.
Okay.
Yeah?
Could we go to a great quote from your paper? Here is a lovely photo of you in the field, which I requested. You're the one without the hat, I think.
Yeah, that's Billy Armstrong, Southern Arrernte man, who's known generally as White Hat.
Ah, okay. So in your paper, you said you quoted Stanner from 1979, and we use this excerpt in the Nully report also. So the associating of a totem with a collection of people was that which transformed them from just a collection into a group with a sign of unity. When everything significant in the world was thus parcelled out among enduring groups, the society became made up of perennial corporations of a religious character. Each group was corporate in all that its totem signified and symbolised. Aboriginal totemic groups were thus sacred groups in perpetuity. The yearly round of rites let the Aborigines renew both the sources and the bonds of life constituted in that way. I thought this was a great one because it really took us to, from Nick's description of the groups and the clans that he was spending a lot of time discussing, explaining, to basing them in a worldview, which was that they're not just groups, that they are sacred groups.
Yeah, or they're comprised of people who have sacred connections, both to each other and to country, right? So I think that's the simple kind of way that I would look at it. So your question out of that is to do with how do we categorise connection as religious? That's going to that question.
Yeah, so can you say something? Well, we might come back to that totemic groups and that nature of them, but can you say something about categorising connection as religious as opposed to spiritual, or even, as Radcliffe Brown put it, magico-religious?
Yeah, okay. So although Durkheim's not particularly popular, hasn't been for a long time, I think I remain a bit of a fan. He certainly had a large impact on my original anthropology when I was learning it and stuff. So I think I'd point in that direction in terms of the social theory behind this. You know, Durkheim in the elementary forms of the religious life argued quite vehemently that you could not define religion, or it could not be adequately defined as just spirituality or animism or any of those particular kinds of things. He was absolutely adamant that what counted about religion was that there were things that were sacred, okay? And he thought that that notion of sacredness was something that wasn't something that you could do away with, right, in any society. But of course, things are kind of calibrated or coordinated differently in different kinds of societies as to what that means. So that word sacred, of course, has been really critically important in the way in which we've conceived of Aboriginal people's relationships to land across time. And it's the sacredness of them that often gets pushed to one side, if you like, when we do a kind of materialist-inspired or bureaucratically inspired set of rules about belonging to your father's country and belonging to your mother's country and all that kind of thing. Durkheim also thought that religion had to be distinguished from magic, because magic was just a kind of instrumental activity. So pointing the bone might be magic, but it's not sacred, that kind of thing. So it was something else, and it was something about the moral order, the way in which you relate to other people, the way in which you relate to your environment, that as a whole, that had to have some kind of sacred qualities in order for people to be committed to it. Okay, so he used Aboriginal material when he talked about the clan, and I think while his analyses are still valuable, I'm not sure that, you know, we would do things in quite the same way these days. So I think religious, to talk about people's connection to country as religious, is to talk about it as sacred. And people, Aboriginal people familiar with English, do indeed talk about it as sacred. And moreover, they immediately bring that into the question of law. Right? Law as the underpinning of society. Now, we also have, you know, we spend a lot of time with the idea about the rule of law And we have lots of ceremony associated with courts and judges, not least of all in native title, of course. And we have a lot of symbolism attached to all of that. And it would be fair to say that we regard a lot of that stuff as embodying our sacred values. But that's very much a rationalist, materialist system that still has this kind of religious quality, or this sacred quality. What I said earlier was that Aboriginal people don't have that same kind of materialist, rationalist system. They have something that is materialist plus. And that other side of it is this this attitude towards the non-human realm, if you like, that it's capable of a kind of intentionality that's similar to human intentionality, and in fact fundamentally the same.
Well, let's talk about the plus. I like that as a concept, and not just what they don't have that we have in this modern world, but what classically was believed. So my favourite part of your paper is where you describe country as an infinite source of ancestral stuff. And that just sounded very much like you. What's in the word country as opposed to lands and waters that we get in the Native Title Act?
I've often wondered where Aboriginal people picked up the English word country, right? It's obviously, like a lot of Aboriginal English, it's mimetic, right? They've taken it over, but in the use of the word, it duplicates what whitefellas say, but it's also turned on its head to mean something different from what whitefellas say. So I don't know anybody who's written about this notion in Aboriginal English. They may have, but I suspect, I mean, we tend to use country to refer to either the bush or, i.e., outside of the sort of civilised realm. I don't think that would have been. It may have come from that, but it's just as likely to have come from people having, talking about their country, Australia, nationalism, those sorts of things that we associate with, sacred ideas about attachment to country and so on. So
it's not the countryside, it's something more,
Yeah, it's something about attachment.
And Povinelli had that great term, sentient landscape, and that sentience kind of is going to what you were describing as intentionality.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That it's that there is intentionality out there in the landscape and in its other creatures apart from human beings. I mean, Aboriginal languages, in my experience, limited experience, because I'm not a linguist, and I don't speak properly an Aboriginal language, but people generally have a word for place. And I guess that one of the things we know popularly about this is that place is capable of, it could describe anywhere. It could describe a water hole, a small water hole, as a home, or as a home to an ancestor, or as where we camped, or that kind of thing. But it's also used, the same term is used for a big, wide area, our country. We mob live, that sort of thing. So
can you talk about the ancestral stuff in relation to this concept of country, the way it's used?
I think, if you think about it as analogous to, say, nationalism, we always have to have our stories about how the country was built. Right? We've had now for a couple of hundred years or more this colonial narrative in which it's been hammered and hammered and hammered, and there's no doubt that has created, our evaluation of who we think we are and what the country is and all the rest of it. Well, within Aboriginal paradigms, we know that they do, in a sense, exactly the same thing. They have stories. They have stories about the way in which the country was formed, not necessarily only speaking about, creating mountains, creating valleys, creating rivers and all the rest of it, but naming them, giving them significance, placing powers there, powers that are associated with people that ancestors whose spirit has come back into living corporeal bodies, your own, mum's, your dad's, all your relations. So all that country is, they laid down. The ancestors laid down the country. So that's where their power continues to lie. But that country produces that power in the way the world works, including in the way that animals come into being, including the way that human beings come into. That's the stuff. That's the stuff that's kind of there and which gets incarnated in various things. In itself, it's incarnated in country only, but it's involved in life cycles of various kinds.
That's a very religious word, the incarnate. I remember that from my childhood. So It takes me to, in your paper, you say a group source is in country. Original ancestral identification continues as the transfer of substance. And you wrote that Sutton calls this an identity of spirit, a consubstantiality. So I grew up Catholic and I'm familiar with one kind of consubstantiation, but can you expand on how is that meant in this native title context?
Okay, so what I was saying just now is that you are, as a person, you are connected to, you have a totemic identity, yes? So if you have a totemic identity, this spirit baby has come into you while you're in utero, and it has grown into who you are. And there's a nurturance process that's associated with that, of course. And that nurturance process, goes through a complete life cycle. So all those totems are grounded in the country, and every person has one or more associated with it, depending on where they were born and who they were brought up by and where they were brought up. So these totemic essences are there in the people around you all the time.
And it's not just animals, right? It's not just the kangaroo or the frog. It can also be elements like the rain.
Yeah, rain, the sun. There's fire dreamings. There's a night dreaming in Central Australia. There are some, I think even these days, there are some sort of what you might call post-colonial dreamings like pussycat and so on. So these are, Aboriginal systems are very open to these ideas. Something like a pussycat gets understood in a totemic way. Yeah. So you're talking about consubstantiality. If you've got all these people that share spirit with these totems, and they don't just share spirit with these totems, they share flesh. This is to do with the materiality of this issue. It's not a question that Aboriginal people are spiritual as opposed to material. In fact, that, as I tried to emphasise earlier, that is very much not what they're about. I'll give you an example. I remember a man telling me that another man had, he'd been raised to know all about the honey ant dreaming because when he was born, they were absolutely in no doubt whatsoever that he was a honey ant man, not just because he'd been conceived at a certain place, but because he had honey dripping from his tongue. These
literally,
literally. I mean, I don't know, maybe he had a sore, or something, but they interpreted that as a material, as a flesh connection to the honey ant. The honey ant would be regarded as a brother, as an elder brother, in fact. Species are always regarded as kin, as siblings.
I think I've got a great quote about that we can come to from your paper. You said spirit child, and it reminded me, we found in Radcliffe Brown's writing on Ingada, he did talk about spirit children emanating from certain special spots in the country. It made me realise when we wrote Nully, we really had to spell out the obvious, that in classical times, people didn't have modern scientific biological notions of descent, which are wrapped up now syncretically when people talk about bloodlines. I'd love to hear the account of classical Aboriginal understandings of descent or filiation you might give to a legal audience.
Okay, so the first thing I'd say about it is it's related to an experience I had in Central Australia when I had a genealogy and I was going down the genealogy from the top to the bottom, and he told me off because that was the wrong way to do it. You have to go from the bottom to the top, right? Yeah. You have to go back to the ancestors. Now, that might seem trivial, but it's not trivial, and in fact, it is a question of ascent. Yeah. We go back to the ancestors. We talk about that as descent, by Aboriginal people, as it were, tip it upside down and turn that into ascent, because there's this notion that they were first, and that everything is referred to that first. So particularly in relation to land, people are talking about the original people of this country who are still there. And we have a bloodline connection to people. Now, I mean, in Western notions of kinship, we talk a lot about blood. And it's these days we're just as likely to be talking about genetic connection as material connection. But there are all kinds of things associated with that, which are sort of metaphysical. They're to do with blood and the heart and love and kinship and all the rest of it, right? Yeah. So there's a book about American kinship that talks about this. So you are kin as a blood relation, but you are an affine as a contractual obligation to somebody, right? So that's the difference. As for Indigenous notions of descent as ascent, I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever in my mind that people did regard blood as being something that is passed, what they now call blood, is something that is passed over.
So we're not talking about being passed from ancestors remembered and known by names, or it's more, as you said, the first, the top, the dreaming level.
Yeah. So
would you say it's that myth?
Well, imagine that these ancestors are in the ground, right? What's happened? They've come into being. They've laboured, they've journeyed, they're all the rest of it, and then they cool down. They go underground, but there remains this sort of spark in them that's able to
like a potency.
Yeah, that's able to come back into life, into your mother.
Yes.
Your mother's blood, if you like, looking after you while you're a child and all the rest of it. Without saying too much about it, ceremonially, blood was very, very significant for men too, but only in the sense of laying down the country, not picking it up. So you have this kind of cycle between men and women that is like this. Women pick up the country, including the children from it. They nurture it. They
gather.
They're at the, they're very much at the sort of fundamental point of what we think of as kinship. This is a mother-child relationship. But then, the genders separate and so on and so forth. So I think this whole question about what Aboriginal people thought of blood and the body and how it's constituted needs a lot more analysis. I don't think we have an awful lot of information, let alone analysis, that goes to this problem. But I think you can read into a lot of the things that Aboriginal people are on record as traditionally doing as implying that people had real blood relationships, that in a sense the corporeal body as a container for flesh, blood, was a very significant thing in relation to the housing of a spirit. That can
it's not just human. It's not just human transmissions. Basically, we're talking about as well. So it's this interesting substance and what Nissa, Dave, and I were calling spiritual imbuement. This kind of essence.
Yeah. I was reading something the other day by Aranda woman that she's written a book about stuff, and she's talking about Gurana, the soul, and she said that Gurana, that animals got that Gurana too, that soul. They got it, and they come into a fleshly form too, right? And they're looked after. So these parallels between the way in which other creatures and indeed the world at large reproduces itself and the way the human family reproduces itself. And when you try to map that over to people's relationships to land and notions of ownership and identification with country, you've got all those complex kin relations that are from the very beginning wrapped up in totemic notions. Okay, so when you're talking about a descent group or a local group, you're talking about these things going on. These spiritual matters, these sacred matters are going on.